The bass. Woo! Woo! Yeah!
Hello and welcome to Fish Not Fish. I'm Fishy, also known in some circles as Gavin, and you're watching Mappa Monday. So, what is Mappa Monday? Mappa Monday is a stream about making maps for role-playing games. I resurrected this idea last week, and afterwards I spoke to some of the viewers, and it became very clear to me that what people really wanted from Mappa Monday streams was less me randomly mucking about with maps, and more something that would act as a tutorial for using the Campaign Cartographer 3 Plus software. Why me? That's an interesting question. There are much better cartographers out there. There are people who know the software much better out there. There's all kinds of reasons why it should be someone who isn't me, but those are also the reasons why it should be someone like me, because I'm not a professional cartographer, I'm not an expert. I have a good familiarity with the software, yes. I've been using Campaign Cartographer since it was in DOS, so pre-Windows 95, which, as the name suggests, for those of you not old enough to actually remember this, came out in 1995. But I'm just a gamer, I'm just a GM. I don't make professional maps, I make maps that work for my games. And if I can make maps that work for my games with my limited set of skills, then you can make maps that work for your games with whatever set of skills you've got or can learn. So as a result of this, I'm embarking on a new project starting today. This is going to be a brand new map. It's not a brand new setting that I'm drawing a map for. It's one that I came up with and started developing 2 or 3 years ago, but I had a hard drive crash and hadn't backed the maps up to the cloud. So I dropped the setting and any campaign that would have been associated with it at that point, for the simple reason that I'm ADHD and I hate redoing material I've already done. And I know that's not an ADHD thing, that's an everybody thing, but it's worse in ADHD people. So this is not going to be a traditional tutorial, because around here we don't do things like the neurotypical people do. It's going to be a little bit rambling, it's going to be a little bit vague. It's done live rather than carefully scripted and recorded in advance and then edited to create a lovely tutorial that goes on YouTube. It will be going on YouTube. And if you're watching on YouTube, hi, remember to like and subscribe and all that jazz. But I'm doing it on Twitch live, partly because recording and editing videos for YouTube is stressful for me. It's the kind of project I can't necessarily do, but what I can do is just sit down in front of a camera and a microphone with a piece of software that I know and love and make a map. So first things first about making maps. First thing you need when you're going to sit down and make a map isn't a pen or a piece of paper, it's an idea. You need to think about what you're going to map. You need to think about the contents of that map. What's the area you're going to cover? What information does it include, as opposed to maybe what information does it not include? What's the style going to be? What is it representing? The style of the map, the look of the map, imparts information in the same way that its content does. So a mountain range on the map is obviously a mountain range. It imparts the information that there is a mountain range in this location. It's roughly this big. But the style in which the map is drawn also imparts information. If we're drawing, for example, if we draw something that looks like a modern ordnance survey map, really, really useful information, extremely practical, very useful design that has been developed by experts to impart information. But it won't feel right for traditional medieval Western fantasy. So the style of map is one of the things that imparts information to the viewers, to the people using it. It's one of the things that you have to think about. In this case also, this is not just a map of the Anwannen Valley, which is what I'm going to be drawing. It's also, in part, a tutorial. So that's another piece of information. It has to contain tutorial information, not just a map of the Anwannen Valley. So for that reason, my mapping style has been chosen for me. It's not necessarily the mapping style that I would choose. It's not the mapping style I chose last time when drawing a map of the Anwannen Valley, but it will do for the Anwannen Valley. And it's going to be a default Campaign Cartographer 3 mapping style, something that everyone with the software has access to. I have dozens of mapping styles from the Cartographer's Annual, and there's many issues of the Cartographer's Annual that I don't own, and I still have dozens of mapping styles. But we're going to use not one of those, because you following along at home wanting to create a map for your game world might not have those styles. So I might be messing with things that just aren't going to work for you and aren't going to be helpful for you. Another thing worth thinking about is, if I can just bring up the PDF, this little beauty here. If you don't have it, honestly, I recommend that you get it if you're using Campaign Cartographer. It's the Tome of Ultimate Mapping. This may not be the most up-to-date version of the Tome of Ultimate Mapping. I haven't checked whether there's an update that I need to download, but this is a 761 page guide to, well, as it says on the front, to making great looking maps with Pro Fantasy software. The first version of this came out for an earlier version of Campaign Cartographer, and it's been updated and replaced with new versions, and more things have been added to it as it goes along. And it includes sections on base Campaign Cartographer, on Dungeon Designer, City Designer, Cosmographer, Perspectives, Character Artist, Dioramas, the various symbol sets. We have, in the version I've got here, symbol sets 1 to 4. I think there's more than that now, but that's the ones that are covered in this version. As I said, there may be an updated version with more. It also covers the Source Maps series that they did, which is Source Maps Castles, Temples, Tombs and Catacombs, Cities, World War II Interactive Atlas. It covers the Token Treasury. The first Token Treasury, we've been promised that there will be more. I don't know whether that's actually going to happen or not, but we will see. The Token Treasury is an add-on that gives us a whole bunch of fantasy creature tokens and a whole bunch of frames for those tokens, and you can mix and match them and create informational tokens. It isn't just a picture of a troll or an ogre, but it's a picture of a troll or an ogre with a border that tells you something about it, like, this one's the commander, this one might be a wizard, things like that. Fractal Terrains, which is a fractal world mapping program that Pro Fantasy put out, that lets you create a random planet. You can change various settings and fiddle with it and muck about and do an awful lot in creating what that planet looks like, and then export that in such a way that it can be imported to you can export it just as graphics, or in such a way that it can be imported into Campaign Cartographer. So you can create a random map, a random world, then create maps for that world. And finally, it's got a section about the Cartographer's Annual, which I've already mentioned, which is a series of monthly releases for Campaign Cartographer, which you subscribe to on a yearly basis. If you subscribe to an old issue, you get all 12, an old issue, an old year, whatever, an old volume. You get all 12 of that year's releases, possibly 13. Sometimes they do give you a bonus entry, as well as the 12 months of the year. If you subscribe to the current one, you'll get each month's content as it's released over the course of the year. And that contains new mapping styles. So sometimes it may be tutorials or pre-built maps with information on how they were made, but mostly it's new mapping styles or additions to mapping styles that have come out previously. So it gives you loads and loads of different material for making maps in Campaign Cartographer. As I said though, we're not going to be using any of that. We are though probably going to reference the Tome of Ultimate Mapping, because it's very good. It's practical, it's informative, it's graphical, gives us information about the software and also shows us what the results are supposed to look like. And it gives us some of the sort of thing that I was just talking about now, that you don't start with your piece of paper or the mapping software, you start with your idea of the map. So, let's talk about the map we're going to make. We're going to make a map of the Anwannen Valley. What is the Anwannen Valley, I hear you ask? It's a setting I came up with, partially inspired by the book Furies of Calderon, first in a series by Jim Butcher, the author of the Dresden Files. That's what he's best known for. And it's a fantasy series, and in the Furies of Calderon, we are presented with a setting wherein every person has bonded an elemental spirit, one or more elemental spirits, mostly just one. And our hero in that story hasn't, which sets him apart. That's the way these things work. There has to be some reason why our hero is different and becomes our hero. And I rather liked that idea, and there is a game which fits that very nicely. And the game is Mithras. I say Mithras. Mithras is the version that I'm using for this. It's published by the Design Mechanism, written by Lawrence Whitaker and Peter Nash. And it was developed from a previous game. It was developed from RuneQuest 6. Now, RuneQuest is a very well-known game. It's the origin of the now infamous and ubiquitous D100 system, quite often referred to as BRP, the basic role-playing, though actually BRP was developed from RuneQuest, not the other way around. And RuneQuest was the game system that was created when Greg Stafford wanted a role-playing system to go with his world of Glorantha that he'd been working on for however long in things like fiction, stories. And Glorantha has been seen in stories, it's been seen in fictional academia. He wrote an awful lot of what, if Glorantha existed, would be quite dry, long-winded academic texts about Glorantha and its mythology and history, which I find very difficult to read, but are very popular with fans of Glorantha. And of course, it's been the setting for a large number of games, a large number of role-playing campaigns using RuneQuest. RuneQuest, as I have hinted, has had at least 6 editions, because I said this was developed from RuneQuest 6. It's actually, I think, 7 editions. I first found it with RuneQuest 3, which was, I had the version that was published under license by Games Workshop in the UK, and I found that in my friendly local game store and thought, this looks cool, it was very different. But I've never really managed to run it. I had that all those years ago, never really managed to get around to running it for various reasons. I did play briefly in a RuneQuest campaign, so run by some long-term RuneQuest players, but that kind of fell apart, as seems to be, I'm fated not to play this game. Then, some time ago, quite a while ago now, Mongoose Publishing got the license for RuneQuest. RuneQuest was pretty much out of print at that point. Chaosium were focusing on Call of Cthulhu, and what Mongoose did was they got the license and they created their version of RuneQuest. They just call it RuneQuest, but it's commonly referred to as Mongoose RuneQuest. This is Mongoose RuneQuest 1, which I own a large number of books for. I think I own pretty much a complete set of the non-Glorantha books and some of the Glorantha books. And what they did was they took Glorantha back to its second age. It's an earlier setting in Glorantha, and they produced some very good second age material for that. Then they updated that to a second edition, and I can't remember at what point Whitaker and Nash got involved, whether they wrote Mongoose RuneQuest 1 or just Mongoose RuneQuest 2, but somewhere down the line they became the developers of Mongoose RuneQuest. And then, as Design Mechanism, they took over the license and produced RuneQuest 6. Then the license reverted, and because they still had the the game material, but no longer the name RuneQuest or the Glorantha stuff. They turned it into Mythos, and you can hear about that and how they came up with the name on the Mythos Matters podcast. If you go back and check the early episodes of that, that's an interesting interview with Lawrence Whitaker. Some very good interviews on that podcast. I kind of recommend it. I listened through that a while ago. I work nights in a very dull job, but a job in which I can use headphones. So I blasted through all the back the back episodes of that podcast in about a week over the course of various shifts at work. And there's some very interesting interviews about Mythos. So Mythos is a D100 fantasy role-playing game. And it has a number of magic systems. One of those magic systems is what is called animism, which is developed from what RuneQuest called spirit magic, which changed a little bit from edition to edition. In some editions, spirit magic was all about doing combat with a spirit to capture it so that it would cast its magic for you, and that was how you learned a certain set of spells. You would effectively bind a spirit. You didn't cast the spell, the spirit cast the spell, but you had to capture and bind that spirit first in psychic spirit combat. In Mythos, it doesn't work that way. You're still binding these spirits, but they're no longer is it a spirit that gives you a spell spirit, as RuneQuest 3 called it. But it does include the other types of spirit. That includes things like sickness spirits. A sickness spirit can possess someone and make them sick. Madness spirits can possess someone and make them, surprise, surprise, mad. Really, that's just a sickness spirit of the mind. And given that spirits are all of the mind anyway, so it's an odd distinction. There's various dark spirits, or elemental spirits that can influence the elements and animate rock and things like that. All these different types of spirits. And an animist is able to interact with the spirit world and with these spirits, and thus either bully, cajole, or persuade them to do their thing and have and exert power in the real world. I say the real world, in the world of the game, the world of the animist. So I came up with the idea of the Anwannen Valley, and the Anwannen Valley is a valley where the spirits are more common than they are in the rest of the world. Animism is rife, it's found throughout the world, but the Anwannen Valley, the spirits are even more common, and the people have developed a bond with those spirits. So each person in the Anwannen Valley will bond generally at least one spirit. And in Mythos terms, this is going to be down to that's going to be their religion. There will be an Anwannen spirit cult, which I will be developing properly, not in a Mappa Monday stream, but I may do that on stream in a different casual RP stream. And even the lay folk, even just the everyday common people, will bond at least one spirit that will be of some use to them. So if they're a farmer, they might have an earth spirit, which makes it easier for them to till the soil, for example. They might be, a healer might have a spirit that can do some healing. This kind of thing. But then if you progress further into the mysteries of the cult, you can bind more spirits and have therefore more of these abilities at your beck and call. And with the shaman, the priest levels in this cult, they very much are a force to be reckoned with. They're very powerful. They've often got many spirits bound to them into what are called fetches in game terms, and in certain historical, mythological, real world terms. But they will be responsible, for example, for assisting the youngsters in bonding their first spirit and assisting people who want to bond a further spirit later on. That will be who you go to. You go to your local shaman, and they will help you with that. They'll either first you have to persuade the shaman that yes, you're worthy to bond another spirit, and then they will go to the spirit realm and find that spirit and bring it forth, and it will be what's called an allied spirit to the cult, which means it's innately friendly to you. It can you can bond and you can force unfriendly spirits, but the cult won't be doing that. The cult will be doing friendly spirits and bonding them accordingly. And these spirits will be multitude because the Anwannen Valley is full of them. But it's not alone, obviously. The Anwannen Valley is just a part of the world. And I've got some further notes on what we've got. So the primary setting will be the Anwannen Valley, also sometimes known as the Valley of Boundaries or the Valley of Spirits. The Anwannen lies not only on the border between... excuse me while I get the pronunciation on these. I've gone, you may have noticed, for a kind of an ancient Celtic kind of feel. Unfortunately, that means that a lot of it comes from languages, the modern-day versions of which I don't speak. So the Vileworth, northernmost of the Three Kingdoms, and the Aithlic Plains, but also on the border between the worlds of Man and Anwin, the spirit world. Deep within the almost unpronounceable forest, and I know, I kind of, in a way, I hate myself for making this name, but it's a really cool name. It just takes a little bit of a run up at it. Anwannen, yes. Deep within the Anwannen forest, in the heart of the Anwannen, there is purportedly a clearing which at certain times exists within Anwannen. The people of the Anwannen are staunchly independent, fending off raiders from the Aithlic and diplomats from the Vileworth with equal zeal, and they live mostly in harmony with the spirits which are more common in the valley than elsewhere in the world. And this exists on a continent called Kurineth. So, that's a little bit of basic information. None of that information existed before I created the first map of the Anwannen Valley, the one I lost. And I just made a note of that as I was putting elements onto the map. I came up with these things and I wrote them down. So, first time, all I really had in mind was I wanted a valley full of spirits and I wanted it to be vaguely Celtic. This time round, I've got that information to work from, so I've got to make sure that the new map matches that old information. Or I've got to change the old information, but ideally I want to make sure that the new map matches. So let's start our map, shall we? The first thing we will need to do is click the New Map Wizard button, which is hidden behind the Casual RP logo on screen, I'm afraid. But if you have Campaign Cartographer, then even just the little few-page long introduction booklet PDF that comes with it is enough to tell you where that button is, at least. Or worst case, you go to the File menu and you select New Map. So that brings up the New Map Wizard. The New Map Wizard looks like this. It says New Drawing Wizard at the top, and that's because of what CC3 is. CC3 is a CAD package, a computer-aided design package. It's one that has been designed, or at least modified, to work as a mapping package. But it's important to note when you're using it that it is a computer-aided design package, not a mapping tool. There's a lot of mapping tools available on the internet now, either for download or actually just as for use directly from their website. And they're often pretty good. Thing is, they're designed to make a map. This is designed to make a detailed technical drawing, and then has been given a front end that is useful for mapping. So this is a very powerful piece of software. You can go behind the mapping tools on this, and you can make technical drawings with it. It's got all the tools of a CAD package, so you could do detailed technical blueprints and things with this software. It will do that. That kind of capability is what's built into the software before they turned it into a mapping package. That's why it says New Drawing, not New Map. We've got a number of map types on here, not all of which will be present without various add-ons, but we can create a character. That's from Character Artist. It's an add-on. We can create cities. Now you can do that with the base Campaign Cartographer, but most of the city design tools honestly come with the City Designer add-on, which is excellent. You can create Cosmographer map. Cosmographer covers two types of maps. It covers deck plans for spaceships and starships and space stations and things like that, and it also covers galactic system maps, planetary system maps, and also star maps. So quite versatile, obviously designed for science fiction, and with a whole bunch of new material accordingly. Hello Wenchkin, nice to see you here. I've been meaning to get in touch with you actually, because I'm now living nocturnally. because I work night shifts. So that means that basically I'm living on Aussie time. So at some point, I'm going to be trying to get some games together at times that are very unreasonable for people in my time zone, but more reasonable for someone in your time zone. So when I do that, I will drop you a line in case there's anything that I'm playing that you want to get involved with. So beyond cosmographer maps, you can do dioramas. Dioramas are those foldy cardboard models that you can get to go on your gaming table, and this lets you, that's an add-on, lets you make those dioramas, then print them out, fold them up, stick them on the gaming table with real miniatures. Mostly though, I'm going to focus on, although I have that software, I'm going to mostly focus on creating maps to use with a VTT, a virtual tabletop. Something like Roll20 or Foundry, or my preferred virtual tabletop, which is Fantasy Grounds. Then we get to dungeons. Well, if you're interested in mapping for role-playing games, you probably have an idea what a dungeon is. It's not necessarily just deep holes in the ground full of orcs. The dungeon designer software can also be used to map buildings of various kinds. So it's the inside stuff, mapping inside buildings rather than mapping the world. Then we have floor plans. The distinction between dungeons and floor plans is largely in the mind of campaign cartographer. Floor plans is used to refer to the more modern types. So that comes with one of the symbol sets is for modern mapping, and that includes symbols for making modern floor plans. So rather than evil altars and fireball traps, that's got symbols for kitchens, toilets, bedrooms, carpets in the hall, that kind of stuff. Other covers anything they couldn't fit into another category. Overland maps is where CC started. That's your main thing that Campaign Cartographer as a base does, is overland maps. That's where we're going today. It's a map of whether it be a whole world or a continent or a smaller region, all the way down to just a local map that you might do surrounding your starting town if you're doing a bottom-up map. And we'll talk about top-down and bottom-up design in a moment. Perspectives is another plugin that takes dungeons and takes them to make those nice isometric maps where you're looking at it at an angle rather than top-down. And then you can create a symbol catalogue, so you can build your own symbols, import them into Campaign Cartographer, and have maps that look like you want them to look. If you have the artistic talents to build the symbols, you can build those symbols, create a symbol catalogue, and either just use it yourself in Campaign Cartographer, or even spread it around, give it to other people so they can use it and make maps using your symbols, so you can have a map that looks like your kind of mapping. And finally, there's the token treasury style, which is based on the token treasury. That's for building up arrays of miniatures of tokens to be either exported for virtual tabletops or printed out to be used on your physical table, playing around the table. So I'm going to go with an overland map, and I'm going to use the Decide Settings Myself option. You can pick from a predefined template. Predefined templates are exactly what they sound like. It's a map, set size, it's already got a border, it's probably got a background decided, it may have things like a compass rose and a scale already on it when you start. If you decide for yourself, then you decide all that stuff. You put in how big you want it to be, choose a background, that kind of stuff. That's what we're going to be doing here. That will then bring us to a big long list of styles that you can use. I have lots of these because I've spent a lot of money over the years on Campaign Cartographer and its add-ons. A lot of these are annuals. So starting from the top here and scrolling down, let me select one at the bottom of that so that as I scroll down you can get an idea of how far I'm scrolling. We're still on the annual, we're still on the annual, we're still on the annual. Let me just find that. Okay, so that was the bottom of the list initially. There's the bottom of the list now. So 2 full pages worth of this. And we're still on the annual. And here is the first map that is not from an annual style. And I don't have all the annuals by a long chalk. There's a lot of material available. So if you're looking for a particular style for a map and you don't have it, worth going to the Pro Fantasy website and just looking through the back catalogue of the annual. Look at each month, see what style it's using. If you see one you like, buy that year's annual. So when we click on this, it gives us a preview. As you can see, this is a black and white style. This is the Mike Schley Inks Overland. Mike Schley is a name that might be familiar to you. Very prolific, modern cartographer for role-playing games. Did all the maps for the Forgotten Realms for the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Don't know whether other people have come in since, but certainly the initial release of all the maps were all Mike Schley. And this is a black and white mapping style that he did for Fantasy Grounds. There's a symbol set 5 is Mike Schley, but there's also a couple of Mike Schley styles now incorporated into the core campaign cartographer. So these will be labelled slightly differently, hopefully. No, that just says CC3 Mike Schley Inks Overland. Then we've got the Mike Schley Overland. So that, I don't know how clearly you can see that on the stream, but that is the preview is showing us a very familiar looking style that looks a lot like the D&D maps from 5th edition. There's a metric version of each of these as well, because the software works in whatever units you give it. You wanted to map in inches, it'll map in inches. You wanted to map in feet, it'll map in feet. You wanted to map in meters, it'll map in meters. If you wanted to map in parsecs, it'll map in parsecs. Or if in your world you've invented something that you call key miles, which by an amazing coincidence are exactly identical to a kilometre and abbreviate to the same km, that's Glorantha for you, going back to RuneQuest, then it'll map in key miles, whatever you want it to map in. You get to choose that and set the scaling on things. So a lot of the templates, a lot of the styles on Campaign Cartographer default to old school imperial measurements because that's what the majority of fantasy role-playing games use, thanks to the fact that they all copy Dungeons and Dragons, which being an American game is American measurements and not meters. But there's also a metric version if you're measuring in meters. Yep, you could map it in squirrel jumps if you really wanted to. All you got to do is you work out how big a squirrel jump is and put the appropriate data into the machine, and it will do that for you. We've got a hex map style here that comes with CC. Not sure which styles come with the Mike Schley set. As I was saying, I think that the Mike Schley Inks and Mike Schley Overland there are the ones that come in Campaign Cartographer 3. And it's not for some reason showing me the other Schley styles. I could be wrong. I may need to check whether that particular symbol set is installed properly on my machine. But Overland Hex gives you that old school, it's a nicer map than they had back in the days, but it gives you that old school 80s Dungeons and Dragons red box, or actually dark blue box, because that's where hex maps came in style. The red box was Dungeons, then the blue box, the expert set, that gave us hex scrolls and overland mapping. Although all the maps in that box were in black and white, you could get colour maps from TSR that had this kind of hex mapping system. So if you want hex maps, which are nice and easy to understand when you're using the maps, then it's got a style for that. You can have a vector style. Here is a black and white vector style that comes with Campaign Cartographer. Then we've got a colour vector style. So let's just discuss that for a moment. The difference between vector graphics and bitmap graphics. CC originally used vector graphics. Vector graphics is where it actually draws lines. Bitmap graphics, it uses pictures. So a mountain symbol in a bitmap graphic, somebody has created a picture of a mountain. That picture's been imported into the software, and when you place it on a map, it plonks that picture down. And the picture scales. You can scale that picture up and down, but if you scale in far enough, eventually it's going to pixelate because it is a picture like any other picture on a computer. Vector graphics, that mountain symbol is drawn as a couple of lines, line going up, line going down, probably. Maybe something going across to make it look like it's snow-capped. And because those are just drawn lines, Those scale infinitely. You can zoom that in as far as you want and it will never pixelate because it's not made with pixels, it's made by drawing a line. So vector graphics are far more versatile in terms of scale, but they generally don't look as nice as the bitmap. There are some really nice looking vector symbols in this, and with the sheet effects you can get a really good effect, but the bitmaps generally just look that bit nicer. Then we have the CC3 Standard Overland. That's the map I'm going to be using. I've drawn maps using this before. It's a really nice, mapping style. The only reason for not using it is if you just don't think it fits your world. If you want a dark fantasy world, you might want something a bit grimmer than this. And because it's the default campaign cartographer style, which means that everybody who isn't building their own mapping style or hasn't spent a lot of money on mapping styles or spent a lot of time searching for the exact style they want and bought that particular style, this is the style they're going to be using. So your map has a danger of looking like other people's maps if you use this style, because it is so common, so easily available. But it's what I'm going to use because it's what everybody's got if they're using this software. Carrying on though, we've also got a CC Pro Overland. That's a Campaign Cartographer 3 version of the default mapping style from an earlier version. So it went Campaign Cartographer 2, Campaign Cartographer Pro, which was basically an update to 2, then 3, and then 3 Plus, which is where we are now. And some of the styles from Pro people liked, so they did 3 versions of them. The earlier annuals for Campaign Cartographer were all made for CC Pro and have since been updated to CC3 so that they all work with the new software. And then after that, I've got a bunch of ones from the symbol set. So symbol set 1 introduces some new fantasy mapping styles. Symbol set 2 is dungeons, so they're not in this list because obviously this list is overland styles. Symbol set 3 is modern, so that's where we get modern political maps and what they call the Pro Standard Overland. So that again, that's a CC Pro modern mapping style updated to CC3. But we're going to go with the CC3 Standard Overland because it's a nice map, it works well, it'll give us what we want, and everybody will be able to follow along at home. Isn't that nice? So we'll create our CC3 standard map, and the next thing it gives us is this page here, which is to create our basic map. So it's showing us the border that this mapping style includes, and it's showing us at the moment a water background. This style assumes that you're going to have water as your background and draw a landmass on top of it. You can change that on the next page. You can change that backing style, that background style if you want. You can, if you know you're drawing in the middle of a big continent and you're just going to have to put land over the entire thing, then you can drop that and put a nice green background, nice green land background instead. I tend usually to stick with the water, if only because even if I'm drawing something that's not going to be an island, I generally like to have a bit of coastline on there somewhere, just in case I want my players to be able to go to the coast and do interesting things with boats. So I'm probably going to leave that as it is. Underneath we have the dimensions. It defaults to 1000 by 800, and the default scale is that's in miles. That would be in meters if you're drawing in metric. So obviously this same default values give a much smaller map if you're using a metric style, because 1000, so not kilometers, not meters, rather. 1000 kilometers is just under half 1000 miles. It's nowhere near as big. But if you're working in meters, then logically you must understand how big meters are and therefore get an idea of how big you want your map to be. If you're not working in meters, it's probably because you don't think in meters, in which case you'll have a good idea how big 1000 miles is. 1000 by 800 is a goodly size. It's not bad at all. I'm going to break from the advice that Pro Fantasy gives you here, though, because, as I've said up front, I am neurodivergent, I have ADHD, My brain doesn't work the way neurotypical brains work. I do things different. I have a habit of doing really big maps and then zooming right in to do detail on them and never exporting the whole map, because the whole map is just too cluttered, because it's done at a detail level that is too great for the size of map that I'm drawing, unless you export it as a really, really big file, in which case your computer has a fit when you try and load it. Less so with modern computers, they're so powerful. And yeah, trying to actually get a print of a map that's drawn on a scale where you need at least an A1 or A0 even to be able to really see any of the detail that's on it is a pain in the neck. But I tend to draw like that anyway. I go, rather than doing lots of maps and stitching them together, I do one big map and go right in on the detail, just because that's the way my brain wants to do things. So I'm kind of going to do that here. I'm going to double these numbers. I'm going to change this to 2000 by 1600, which is a goodly size area. If you consider that a party on foot in D&D terms will probably traverse something like 24 miles in a day. You want to get realistic numbers as to how you can travel. There's a lot more detail than that, obviously, but if you go to Dungeons and Dragons, they're going to tell you something like, you can travel 24 miles in a day. And mysteriously, there will be an inn every 24 miles along the road. How convenient. But if you're travelling that 24 miles a day, then upping these numbers a little bit, we can see that in 100 days, you will be able to travel 2,400 miles. A little bit bigger than our map is. So that means that an adventuring party that is spending a lot of time on the road, if they keep going in one direction, is going to run out of map in 2 years of travel. Mostly they're not going to keep going in one direction, and if you've got an exploration-based game, they're probably going to be going back and forth and not travel anywhere near that far. But this is the kind of thing you need to consider when you're drawing your map. Is your map going to actually accommodate the game you're going to play? If you're playing a city-based political drama where most of the players will leave the city, player characters will leave the city for, say, a week or two on an expedition to go to a particular place and do something, then you only need, really, for your map to cover a couple of weeks' travel outside of the city. If you want your players to be roaming around looking for adventure and going to all kinds of interesting places and playing those quest-type scenarios that we're so familiar with from, for example, Lord of the Rings, then you need a bigger map. So in this case, we're going to have 2000 by 1600. We are going to give our map a title, which we are going to give the title of Kereneth, which, as I said earlier, is the name of the continent that the Anwannen Valley is on. We'll give it a copyright notice. Do we really care about copyright? Probably not. If we do give it a copyright notice, you'll just have a little copyright embedded in the metadata and possibly included on the map itself. But don't really care about copyright on this, because this is a tutorial for people and doesn't need to be in the metadata. If somebody, if I were to want to publish the map, for example, it would be fairly obvious if someone had nicked it that it's that map. So I don't really care too much about that. At this stage, I can hit finish and it'll give us a map to work on. Or I can hit next and it'll give us another screen with yet more choices to make. So going forward, this is where we can change the map background. For starters, we've got a checkbox. We can turn it off completely. We can do without a map background. So if you're going to draw black and white, for example, you could turn off that background, because white background, why draw a white square if you're going to print it on white paper? So you could just turn off the background. If you have the background turned on, you've got a drop down. We're currently using the water dark. Depending on where in the world we want to set this, we might want to change that. We might want to go with lighter. So give it a more sunny Caribbean feel by giving it a lighter water shade. Or we might want to go with darker. If we're not going, if we're going for a slightly grimmer setting, we might want darker water. Going to darkest water there. Darkest water makes me think of old pulp fiction, to be honest, like deep in darkest Africa. Don't know why it was always dark. Bleeding light over there, I would imagine. Lots and lots of sun on the equator, but there you go. So we'll go back to water normal. There's not just water. We can have a swamp background. If you want to draw a map that's all set in a swamp, we can use the swamp background. Plain, scrub, mountain, mixed forest, solid colours in whatever colour. And if we were drawing a vector map, we would have backgrounds based on the vector fills available to us as well. We can have grassland. I'm going to stick with the water normal for this. What I'm going to do over on the right is I'm going to turn on the grid overlay here. Because I'm going to be drawing a grid anyway, may as well do it up front. And press the grid settings button, lets us choose. So we can have a hex grid. And for a hex grid, it gives us a choice of a horizontal hex grid or a vertical hex grid. Honestly, I can't remember which is which. I'm assuming, however, I'm going to guess on this, because if you think about a hex, the way it's arranged, it's got two flat sides and two pointy sides, essentially. So, fairly certain that the horizontal hex grid has the flat sides going horizontally and the vertical hex grid has the flat sides going vertically. The only difference that makes is in what the grid looks like on your map. Personal choice, use whichever one you want. Defaults to horizontal. I'm going to use horizontal, but I'll look at the other options as well. We have a square grid. A square grid needs a single value in grid spacing, which is going to be how many miles, in this case, how many units the grid square is across. So if you're doing a dungeon map, for example, for Dungeons and Dragons, then your grid size is going to be obviously 5, with the scale being in feet. 5 foot, standard 5 foot dungeon map. If you're drawing for an old school D&D, something from the old school Renaissance, as they like to call themselves, then that would probably be 10, because the old school D&D maps weren't used for battle maps. They were just used to show you what the dungeon looked like. All of the combat in old school D&D was done narratively, what's now pretentiously called theatre of the mind. But in the old days, we didn't call it theatre of the mind combat, we called it plain D&D. And we might have miniatures on the table, but we wouldn't have a map, we wouldn't have a grid. We might use inches, because the numbers in the original versions were all in inches instead of feet. And that was tabletop inches. That was obviously inherited from Chainmail, the tabletop war game that it was developed from. So your square grid is obviously going to be a grid of squares in whatever scale. This defaults to 50 miles per square on the grid. That's way too much for me. I like my grids to be finer than that, even for overland mapping. But in this case, if we just chose those defaults and ticked on square, you'd have 50 miles to a square on your map, and that gives you a good idea for long distances. You can look at it and you can go 1, 2, 3, 4 squares. Okay, it's about 200 miles. You can do the same thing with hexes, of course. You can get 1, 2, 3, 4 hexes. Oh, it's about 200 miles. We can have an isometric grid. Going back to, I mentioned the perspectives add-on. So isometric grids are those diamond-shaped grids that are designed to look like a grid map, but if you're looking down on it from above at an angle rather than flat down, so you get a kind of a 3D look to it. Harder to draw. Don't touch them. I've got the software for it. I've got the add-on for it. I don't touch them. One day I'll do an isometric just to prove to myself I can, but haven't done it yet. I'm sticking with my horizontal hex grid, and I'm changing my grid spacing. Now, traditional overland maps in tabletop role-playing games usually use either 12 miles to a hex or 6 miles to a hex, and again, that's inherited from Dungeons and Dragons because of the movement rates. A character in Dungeons and Dragons, the standard character in old school D&D, had a movement rate of 12, which translated to 24 miles in a day, or 2 hexes. 6 is obviously 12 is divisible by 6, so you can fit the hexes in, and that works out nicely. It's a little bit arbitrary, but it's been kind of picked up by the rest of the gaming world, because almost everyone, less so now, but traditionally almost everyone has either learned and cut their teeth on Dungeons and Dragons or learned from someone who learned and cut their teeth on Dungeons and Dragons. Neurodiversity, I don't use those numbers. Never use those numbers. I like nice round numbers. So, therefore, my hexes are 15 miles across. Your mileage may vary, literally. Part of the reason I use the 15-mile hex is that when I was designing some rules for my own Obsession game system, I used the 15-mile hex for part of the optional rules that I came up with for kingdom definition. I crunched a few numbers for population sizes and the space needed to accommodate those population sizes, primarily based on information published by S. John Ross in his, I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was an article on medieval demographics for gamers, basically. That article, I believe, is still available on the internet. Some really good stuff in there. Some of it is now a little out of date, but it's still a good basis, a really good article. And I crunched some numbers, and a 15-mile hex worked out very nicely for what I wanted to do and the numbers I wanted to use in Obsession Simple Fantasy. So I use a nice 15-mile hex. 15 miles just works for me as well. So I can still just count up the hexes, and I can say, okay, you've got to travel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hexes, so that is going to be 75 miles. Nice and easy. So putting my grid spacing to 15, that's not the right way to do it, it's not the wrong way to do it. The right way to do it is a grid size that works for you, that you can work with because you're the one who's going to be using the map. I'm going to turn off labeling. If we have labeling on a hex grid, then we have a choice between labels outside or labels in cells, and that will be effectively, it's the same with a square grid. If you think of a square grid that might have A, B, C, D along one axis and 1, 2, 3, 4 along the other axis, and you can identify where something is by going, it's in cell A4. Or in hexes, it's usually done with 2-digit numbers. So each cell in a hex grid will usually have a number like 0304, which is 03 by 04. And if you tick the in cell version of labeling, it will actually put that number into every cell of your grid on the map. So if you think, if you've played any board-based war games, not miniature tabletop-based war games like Warhammer or Chainmail, going back to that, but ones that actually come with a map that you lay out, those are usually hex-based, and those usually do have labels in each hex so that you can identify where something is. Games like BattleTech, for example, or the historical war, a lot of historical war games do it that way. That can be very useful and look really good, and I've done that on the map that I use for my Wild Sea game on Druttercup's channel, which I need to get back to actually. They've made their first journey, and I've got to get back to the game with their next journey. But what I did with that is I just did a simple hex map with very little information on it, but with a hex grid. So as they find things, because that game is player driven, the GM doesn't write scenarios for that. The GM is just responsible, the Fireflies they call it in that game, is just responsible for what happens according to what the players decide to do. I can make a note of what hex they find things in, and it's very easy then to update the map. But I don't use labeling on standard fantasy maps because I find it gets in the way, particularly if you've got a big map with a 15-mile hex grid. 15 miles, I'm going to have the hex grid turned off most of the time when using this map, when working on this map, because if you look at a 2,000 by 1,600 mile map with a 15-mile hex grid on it, all you can see is the hex grid. It becomes just like a fly screen over the top of the map, so you have to turn it off to be able to see the thing unless you're zoomed in. And if you have a label in every grid, it would just becomes a plain white piece of paper, or plain whatever colour you're labelling in piece of paper, essentially. So the labelling I have turned off, but if you want labelling on your map, either on the outside or the inside, then go ahead and do so. I would recommend it only on maps of smaller areas. If you're doing 100 by 8 miles by 80 miles with a 15-mile grid or a 10-mile grid, then yeah, you've only got a 10-mile grid on 100 by 80. You've got 10 by 8 grids, and 10 by 8 squares. You've got a label in each square there. That's not going to take up an awful lot of space on your map. Go ahead, but I wouldn't recommend doing it on a bigger map. So we have got horizontal hex grid, 15-mile scale, no labelling. That's the choices we've made here. And now I can press finish again, or I can move on. I could press finish here, but I'm going to move on to the next tab just to show you what's on it. This tab isn't really for overland maps, unless you're doing something really clever with your map, which you might want to do, particularly if you're playing something like Planescape. This gives us multiple levels. If you enable multiple levels, then when it saves this map, it will generate a map for each level and let you work on each level individually, but also let you link between those maps. And down in the corner, it will give you a little box that contains each of the maps, each of the levels listed, and those will be hyperlinked. So when you click on one, it will load that map, letting you move back and forth between the maps. As an example, you could do this for buildings. You can have a 4-story building using Dungeon Designer, make it that way, put each level on its own map with the link in the corner to click between the maps, and that lets you do multi-level things. Really, really good. You can specify the number of levels above ground and the number of levels below ground. So the ground floor will probably have the background, like the grass background, say, outside the building. The ones below might have a rock background. The ones above probably have the grass, but you might want to put some kind of filter in to make it obvious, sheet effect to make it obvious that you're higher above the ground. You can add a roof drawing by ticking the little box for that, which will give you just one extra level on the top, so that you can have your 4-story building and also have a map of the roof if the characters are going to climb up on the roof and maybe have a sword fight on the roof while dashing through the city, that kind of stuff. You can also have the drop down here for the naming scheme that it will use. It defaults to the American naming scheme. You may notice, listening to me, I am not American. I do not use the American naming scheme. I apologise to Americans watching any of my actual play streams, and indeed have been known to apologise to Americans playing games with me, that I do not use the American naming scheme. If I say first floor, I don't mean the ground floor. I mean the floor above it. British naming scheme, for those who don't know, we number the floors above ground. We have a ground floor, which is the floor level with the ground. When you walk into the building, you are on the ground floor. Then we have levels above that. So the first floor is the first level above that. The third floor is the third level above that. The American naming scheme, of course, starts at 1 at the ground floor. 1, 2, 3, whereas we go ground 1, 2. That's the distinction there. And because people around the world want to be using this map, or want to be using this software, it lets us choose which we're using. It also gives us the German naming scheme. I've got no idea how Germans level their levels. I'd have to ask a German. No clue. But it gives us that as an option anyway. Also gives us deck rather than floor. So if we're doing a ship or a spaceship, then we can have that labelled by deck rather than labelled by floor. And dungeon, so we can label it by dungeon level rather than floor. You don't have the first floor of a dungeon, you have the first level of a dungeon, and it goes downward, not upward, in a dungeon. So we have the different naming schemes. Not relevant here because we're not using multiple levels, so we'll turn that off. I only came across to this tab to show you that it's there for other maps you may want to do. So pressing finish, that gives us a save dialog saying, well, we're making a map. Where do you want to put it? In my case, I am just going to quickly put it in my RPG's general Dropbox folder, and we're calling it kiddeneth.fcw. FCW is the file extension for maps from Campaign Cartographer. Right, now it's given me this, because I've been sat here talking to you, telling you about how to building a map. So Campaign Cartographer wants me to save the map that I have only just this second created and have yet done nothing with, because it's time-based. And this is something you can change in the settings when it prompts you, or if it prompts you at all. Now, mentioned before, ADHD. I have ADHD. That means that I have executive function problems, including problems with aspects of my memory. And I hyperfocus. I start drawing a map and I get so into drawing the map I forget about everything else. So the way hyperfocus works like that is, at the end of the thing I'm hyperfocused on, my brain will have, at the beginning, my brain has basically said, Martha, hold all my calls. And at the end of it, it then says, right, I'm done. All right, Martha, what have we got? And everything that my body wanted me to know about comes back in, having been blocked out for the time in between. So at that moment, suddenly I needed to get up and dash to the loo, because I've been wanting to go to the loo for an hour, but my brain has been filtering those signals and not telling me. Suddenly I realise I'm hungry or I'm tired, whatever. Part of this is I don't think to keep saving the program necessarily. I've had to train myself to save on a regular basis. So I leave these reminders turned on. They're really useful for that. And all it does is it just says, it's been X minutes since you last saved or loaded the current drawing. You should save your work now. What do you want to do? Save now, ask later, or disable autosave. It's your program, it's your map. You want to click disable autosave, you go ahead and do so. But for my mind, don't click disable autosave. Never click that. Nothing worse than having a sudden power cut and losing 4 hours of mapping because you didn't do any saves. Rather, there are things worse, obviously, many things worse, but people say things like that, don't they? So I'm not going to save now, I'm going to say ask later, because I'm saving it now anyway. I've just told it where to save this. Now what you can see there is ugly, because what you can see there is a blue background with a fine mesh over the top of that. It's my fixed 15-mile hex grid. Told you it looked like a fly screen. If I zoom in on a portion of the map, we can see that it is indeed a horizontal hex grid. So there's two ways that we can deal with this sat there looking horrible. First is we open up the sheets dialog, which we can do simply by clicking up here. Let's actually run from, let's close that for a moment. Let's run from the right hand side across. This is stuff that's behind me and the Hobby Gamers International logo, so you can't see it, but if you've got the program, you'll see it on your program. And it's easier to run from right to left than from left to right, because from left to right, there's a big box there that we're going to ignore. So from left to right, from right to left rather, the rightmost box is the fill style. Currently set to hollow. We can click on that and it'll bring us up a fill style properties thing, so we can change our fill style. So whatever tool we're currently working with, we'll use the fill style that we have selected on here. It might be a vector pattern, it might be scalable hatching, it might be a bitmap style, bitmap pattern, it might be symbol fills. We can make these changes. If you're going to change the fill style, remember to select your tool first, then change the fill style, because when you select the tool, it will set the fill style that is appropriate for that tool. It's coded into the tool. So it'll overwrite whatever change you've made. So if you want to change the fill style, remember, select tool, then change the fill style. The next box is line style. Again, when you select the tool, it will set the line style. So if you want to change the line style, select the tool first, then change the line style. And here, we can have a solid line, we can have various dashed lines. We've got a new button, so we can create our own new dashed line. So you can actually set, it's not just dashes, you can set the length of the dash, you can set funky patterns. If you want your line style to read SOS to people who know Morse code, it'll do that. Then the next thing after the line style, we have got the layer. So sheets and layers need a little bit of discussion because they can be confusing to the uninitiated. The program started with just layers. Layers are what they sound like. So they're layers, like in a cake, or you could think of them like pages in a book. If you've got a book of thin tracing paper pages that you can see through, anything you draw on the bottom page will still be visible from the top, but anything drawn on the top page will always be over the top of it. That's exactly how layers work in this. Anything on this layer is always above this layer. As we go down, nice and simple. But then we also have sheets. And sheets do exactly the same thing. One sheet is above another sheet. How does that work? Well, the items are handled differently in sheets and layers. So the layer will be above the other layer, and the sheet will be above the other sheet, and never the twain shall meet. and it's a little tricky to describe, but actually just using it and seeing how it works, very easy to work with, that they stack on a slightly different level, a different meta level. The main thing is that sheets handle all the effects, however, and the layers just contain the symbols. So the symbols aren't really on the sheets, they're assigned to that sheet, but they're drawn on the layer. That's probably confusing, sorry, but that's what actually happens. So the layer includes things like your background layer, borders and political, relief and contours, natural features. You can change these, you can move them around, you can add and remove layers. You can also hide individual layers, or you can freeze individual layers. A frozen layer, anything on that layer cannot be edited, it can't be selected, you can't do anything with it. So for example, once you've got your grid in place, you can choose that will be drawn on probably on the hex grid. Hex stroke square grid is the default name for it. Layer. That layer is frozen by default. I can't mess up my grid. I can't accidentally select my grid when drawing on it. Actually, that doesn't really work. Yeah. I select the grid all the time unless I freeze it on the sheets. But in theory, freezing the layer like that will prevent us from doing that. If I cancel this and I say no, I don't want to save my work yet, and I use the erase tool and click somewhere, it shouldn't select the grid. And indeed, today it's being nice and not selecting the grid. No matter where I select, that grid is on a layer that is frozen, so it's not selecting the grid. I'm not going to accidentally delete the grid when trying to get rid of something that I drew wrong. I don't rely on that. I freeze it on the sheets as well, because the number of times I've sworn after selecting the grid when trying to do something fiddly, it gets very frustrating. So after the layers, and layers are useful on an informational purpose. This is how I tend to use these. Layers I use for informational purposes and sheets for practical purposes. So the difference between items depends on what sheet they're going to be on. But for me, I can organize things by layers. So for example, I can know that all of my cities are drawn on one layer. Or if I'm mapping a city, I can know that all of my bakeries are drawn on one layer. All of my taverns are drawn on one layer. Things like that. So you can organize them and find them in a hurry by selecting, because you can select a layer. So if I suddenly want to say, right, I'm going to highlight every tavern in my city, and I've just spent months creating this city, the 20,000 population, which is probably around 5,000 buildings, say, and I've got 100 taverns in here, and I've decided that I want to move every one of those taverns to a different sheet. Well, if I've drawn them all on the tavern layer in the first place, I can just go Edit Properties, select by layer Tavern, 100 taverns selected, move to Sheet, and move them to my new Taverns sheet. So that side of it is practical, but it's primarily informational. It's on the tavern sheet because it's a tavern, that is a piece of data. After that, we have a width. Width is for the drawing, per line. So we've got a line style. The width of that line is separate, though. That's in the width thing. Again, the tools tend to override this, but a lot of things do have, for example, rivers, say, you'll have, most maps will give you a set of options for rivers, like large river, medium river, small river, and quite often they will have an option, river current width. So whatever you set the width to, it'll draw the river at that width. So if I set the width to 3, say, and then draw a line, that's in map units. The map units are miles. That line will be 3 miles wide. That could be useful if, for example, you're drawing a map that has ley lines on it. If you're playing Rifts or Savage Rifts, much better game, excellent setting, better system, then you can draw ley lines on your map. You set your width to however wide you want the ley lines to be, you set the appropriate colour, maybe you put it on the right layer, you might have a ley lines layer, maybe you put it on the right sheet, you might have a ley lines sheet that will cause it to glow and look really funky. Then you draw it, and the lines will come out looking how you want them to because you've arranged that in advance. Then we have a little square block of colour, which is the colour we're currently working in. It's currently on black. It's kind of like the default. We can click on that and it gives us a select color dialog like that, which looks very familiar to anyone who's done any kind of graphic design. And of course we don't have to use just the colors that are listed on there. We've got down here, we've got this wide space which shows us what we're doing, but there is also an option to define a color. Okay, we click define color and it immediately gives me an error. Colors 0 black and 15 white may not be changed. Always going to have black, always going to have white. And that's what I'm currently using. So if I pick a different color, if I just pick one at random and go for that blue and say define color, that'll let me pick whatever color I want. The number of colors in your map is fixed. What those colors are is not. You can replace any one of them, but you've got a default palette here. You can create and save palettes to reload in at a later date. If you've created a custom palette for your maps for the style that you're using, you can load that palette back in to work on a new map so that it will look like the old ones, things like that. So there's selecting your color. Then, all right, you can save now. Then we have the sheet is the next box. So that's just, we now got to the point where it's just sticking out past Hobby Game, the Hobby Gamers International logo there. You can see it says S:land, sheet, land. It's the current sheet. And that gives us this sheet dialog. So these sheets are where we can apply effects and we can move stuff up and down. And these symbols won't necessarily be above or below one another by being on these different sheets. That's what layers are for. But the effects will be, which in many cases just has exactly the same effect. And we can, if we activate sheet effects, we can select an effects preset. So the preset here, Overland CC3 1000 by 800. Now I could create a new preset because I'm using 2000 by 1600. I could create a new preset for that, which halves the size of all of the effects, so they still look the same. But I find generally I can just carry on with 1000 by 800 because so many things scale in this program that it doesn't really matter anyway. And we've got a new button and a save button for doing that. And then up here, each of the sheets can have a number of effects on them. So let's pick one and see. The land effect, the land sheet. The land sheet has two effects. It has two glows. So the first glow is an outside glow in a kind of very pale blue. Strength is 0%, blur radius of 5 map units. When we set these options, we can choose whether that is percentage of view width, in which case the effect scales to how we're looking at it on screen. Map width, in which case the effect scales to the map and will always be the same in relation to the map, so maybe more or less visible depending on how far we're zoomed in. Or percentage of the drawing extents width. I'd need to look up exactly what that means because I never use it. It's obviously subtly different to map units or view width. No longer measured in map units, but is measured as a percentage of the overall scale of the size of the map. So that would scale with a bigger map, obviously, whereas map units won't. But I don't really play with that, so I can't tell you too much about it. So yeah, that's an outside blur radius 5, but weak pale blue glow. And then the other glow is an inside glow, which is more sort of a parchment colour. Strength 1%, blur radius 1 unit, and that's based on percentage of view width. So that actually scales not to the map itself, but to how we're looking at it. That's intended for us to be looking at in the software, rather than intended to be important when you're printing the map or exporting the map. Other effects that we could have on here, we can adjust the hue or saturation, we can add a bevel, a lighted bevel, we can add drop shadows, we can add a glow, we can make something transparent, we can do wall shadows, subtly different from a drop shadow. A drop shadow is a shadow that's drawn as if the light was coming straight down. A wall shadow, the light is coming in from an angle, as if it was sunlight, say, and you can set a universal angle for that so that all the wall shadows on your map will all fall in the same direction, which gives it a consistency that actually looks much better. Texturize, where you can apply you load in a texture file that will be applied to everything on that layer. All kinds of fun stuff in the effects. Far too many to go into now, but suffice it to say that correctly using the effects is what takes a meh map and turns it into a cool map. The effects in this program are amazing. So that's the drawing sheets. What I've got to do now, because as I said, I have ADHD, is I've got to remember why I went to the drawing sheets in the first place and started telling you about what was up here in this, hidden behind me and Hobby Games International logo. And the answer is because I was going to do something with this this grid. So, a couple of ways we can deal with this grid being here and looking ugly. We can go into the sheets and we can hide the grid sheet. And if we do that, lo, the grid has vanished. But the grid still exists, which means that, for example, we can still snap to that grid if we want to place things neatly in hexes. We don't need to be able to see the hexes. We just set the grid up to snap to the center of a hex. And whether we can see the hex or not, it will still snap to it, so that grid still exists. But what we can also do is, as I said, we can set effects. So we can add to the grid sheet the transparency effect. And we're going to set our opacity, in this case, to 35%. Now, worth remembering which way around these numbers go. You're setting how opaque the grid is, not how transparent the grid is. So in this case, 35% opacity means that it is 65% transparent, so pretty faded out. The number defaults to 50-50, which is just half. I'm going to go with a lower number here so it doesn't get in the way. That means that the grid is going to be quite difficult to actually see, but will still be there. So we will OK that. That adds that transparency. Down here, redraw on OK is ticked. I really need to get that software that makes my mouse glow to make this easier and make it more obvious what I'm doing on tutorials, but I forgot to do that. I thought I said that last week, and I forgot to do it by this week. So then when I OK, it will redraw my map, and now we've still got the mesh there, we've still got the fly screen, but if I zoom in, we can see that it is much fainter. We can do yet more with this, should we wish to. So things I like to do, for example, I could set that transparency even further. I could put it to, say, 15% opacity, which is really damned opaque. Right now, it's there, but you've really got to look for it. But this gets interesting. I can then also add a glow. So if I pick a glow and I say we'll have a, oops, that wasn't black, that was no change. I want black, not no change. So if I pick a black glow and I'm going to give it a blur radius in map units of 0. Let me see, how big a glow do I want? We've got 15-mile hexes, so shall I say half a mile? I'm making these numbers up, I don't know what this is going to look like. I'm going to leave the strength at 12.5, which is what it's defaulting to, just to see what it does. Because I can change it if I don't like it. And that, look, it's strengthened the grid again. Because the grid itself is opaque, but it's got a glow around it. Now the trick that this gives us, that we can mess with to get some really good effects, is we can, for example, actually set the grid itself to being completely opaque, to being completely transparent. In which case, the glow gives us an effect not of a hex grid, but of a bunch of individual hexes drawn with a slightly apart, because the width of the line apart, across the map, and kind of fading out because it's a glow, not a solid line. And you can get some really good effects by messing around with these numbers. Probably not going to keep that, but I am going to zoom in so we can get a clearer idea of what it's actually doing. Zoom right into a hex. I think I need to alter that glow. It's not very visible here because of the scaling. Let's set it to 1.5 units. No, still not really very visible. Trust me, you can get some good effects. I've just forgotten what numbers I need to feed in to do it. It's a matter of experimentation. You can't really break anything, because ultimately you can always just say, oh damn it, that looks terrible, delete that glow, and away it goes. So the best way to learn to use this stuff is just to mess with it. If you're really worried, take advice from the autosave. Save it first, then mess with it. Easiest way to undo what you've done is just to then reload the saves that you made before doing it. So I've now got, because I've turned the transparency on the grid right down, I've got a slightly greyish blue background when zoomed out, but I can see clearly what I'm doing. And it's time for some landmass. So we are going up here behind the casual RP logo, where we've got a little grid of tools. And on overland mapping like this, the first two tools are on the left, default landmass, and on the right, something else. C. Right, so land and C are the first two. If you click on it, you get the default tool. If you right click on it, you get this dialog that lets you choose. So with this, I can choose how I'm going to draw my land. I can draw my land as a fractal circle. I can draw my land as a straight line polygon. I can draw my land as a smooth line. I can also edit these tools, but that's a more advanced topic that we're not going to be going into right now. But if I click the advanced button, you can see that from here I can edit the properties of any particular tool. But I don't want to be doing that right now. So I am just going to go with default land. Default land is a fractal land. It's a fractal polygon. We also have options here for fractal box and fractal circle. But the default land doesn't do that. So a box, obviously it's going to be roughly square, but using fractal to create the wiggly edges. Circle is going to be roughly circular, but with wiggly edges. The default polygon, however, its shape is going to be defined by where I click the points on the way around it. And we get into some useful stuff here, because we realize that the software is smart. The software does not want to draw on the empty tabletop to either side of the piece of paper we're drawing our map on. So if I click over here outside the map, it doesn't go there. It starts from the nearest point on the border. So this means that I can draw down here, get some fractal coastline. When I hit the border, it's going to go straight along the border and go to this corner, come back up, and then I can come back in again, draw a bit of coastline here, back out to the border, up to the corner, all the way across to this corner, and then I'm just going to right click to end there rather than draw all the way down, because I want to just have it follow the border all the way down there. Bingo, there we have a section of land. So we can see it's part of a larger continent, but we can also see sea on two sides, and we can see that it's got nice crinkly edges. Slightly Bartfast would be proud of us. And that's because we used the fractal tool. Now, those crinkly edges look less good. Now right clicking to cancel the tool, by the way, because I right clicked to finish drawing, but that didn't close the tool. So I'm right clicking a second time to close the tool. If I wanted to draw more land, I could have just clicked and started a new one, but I clicked to end it instead. If I zoom in on a bit of this coastline, let's come over here. The closer in we get, the less smooth and lovely these fractals look. Now we can change that if we want to. We can go to, let me try and remember this, I'm out of practice with this software. We can right click on one of these. Which one is it? It's not, there it is, it's that one there. Okay, so this symbol here of the two crossed swords is a useful reference to point you at the tool to the left of that. There's a straight line with an arrow pointing to a wiggly line. That's the fractalize tool. Now if we right click on that, it gives us options, various options. Fractalize is the default tool, but we can also use it to remove nodes, combine paths. We'll go into paths and nodes a bit later. We've used them already because that's how the fractal land was drawn. But we're not editing them or anything right at the moment, so we don't need to understand how it did it. We just need to know that it did it. We can convert lines to paths, we can convert paths to polygons, we can straighten things, we can smooth things, but we can fractal, and we can explode things as well. Exploding is useful, but dangerous. If we explode this fractal poly, for example, every single line that makes up that fractal will become an individual line. And on a fractal, that's a hell of a lot of lines. So don't explode something unless you know why you're exploding it and you know what you want from it and you know that's the right thing. So we can click fractalize and it gives us a dialog which lets us change the strength, the depth, minimum strength, frequency, random seed for randomizing it. You know, if you want to fractalize something based on your birthday, for example, it tends to be what I use in procedurally generated computer games. For ones that have drawn maps based on a seed, I tend to put my birthday in, just because that way I know it's a number I can always remember if I want to use that map again. We've got some saved settings here, but there aren't any because it doesn't default to any. It just has the default settings. And we don't really need to change these default settings. We just know that we are fractalizing lines. So in other words, we are adding chaos, we are adding noise to the lines and making them more squiggly. So then if I click on that, that's selected two entities, which is good because that means we're doing the whole land. The land has been drawn as two separate entities because that's how the sheet works. And then we go do it. And we will redraw. We're not going to save just yet. We want to check how this comes out and then we will save afterwards. We will redraw and the land now looks a bit smoother, a bit squigglier because it's gone all the way around the whole of that line and it's added extra squiggle. Still not going to save, and there's a reason we're not going to save, and that's the reason we're not going to save. It's fractalized the straight lines that were drawn around the edges of the map. There are dangers to using any tool. Powerful tools do a lot, therefore there are dangers. Now in this case, we've not fractalized a great deal. It's not that difficult to fix. We can go to the delete node button, which is down here next to the anvil, and we can click on the node we want to delete and away it goes. And we can come over here and do it there and away it goes. And that's the only two places where it's added an additional node and messed up our border. So now we're done. If we had fractalized to a greater degree, to a greater depth, then we'd have more nodes to delete and it might be inconvenient. So better to get the fractalization right in the first place. But we didn't need to fractalize further on this map. It's only because because I'm planning to use the map at a different scale to what it was drawn at, that it becomes at all relevant that I might want to smooth these down a little bit further. So now we've got some nice pretty fractal land. There we go. That is our... Oh, hang on. I only deleted one of the two nodes in that location. Remember I said that it was editing two entities? That's because the land has an outline. This blue outline didn't delete the node there. So again, delete node. Click on that. Then when I zoom out, the blue line will be right there. And so I can be sure I'm clicking in the right place, I'm going to zoom in to select the node I want to delete over here. Delete node. Away it goes. Zoom back out. And then I'll resave. So that's more like it. Yeah, a lot of these mapping styles, things that appear to be a single object are actually multiple objects. One of the things where you find that quite commonly is roads. Often you will have two layers to a road. You'll have a road surface and you'll have a road something underneath. That when the two are both placed on the map in the appropriate sheets with the appropriate effects makes a really nice looking road. But the way it does that is by drawing it twice, and that's all built into the tools, but it's something that you need to be aware of on a tool-by-tool basis, unfortunately. There's no universal law. And the only way to learn that really is by doing and realizing, oh, hang on, I'm only deleting half the road here because it's drawing it in two places. Where it becomes particularly important is with buildings, which are grouped objects in City Designer. So they have a specific tool in City Designer for moving buildings rather than just using the standard copy-paste. And that's always advisable to use selected from the tools menu, because otherwise buildings can give some really weird effects. But we're not doing buildings here, we're doing an overland map. And all we need to worry about is making sure that the outline on our land works, which it does. Just to give us an idea of some of the things we can do here, there's an info menu up at the top here, and if we go to info, we can select distance. So we can say, okay, so at roughly its narrowest point, how wide is this bit of land between these two seas? And we can see that it is 944.9 miles approximately. 944.90302 approximately, if you want to be really approximate. So we know that at its narrowest, it's nearly 1,000 miles between those two bodies of water. We're drawing this on a big enough scale that these are not close. But then again, anybody familiar with the North American continent is looking at it and going, is that all? Or they might be thinking about Central America and thinking, bloody hell, that's a long way. Having got our landmass, we need to think about what we want to put on it. A lot of this map, initially at least, is going to be empty for me. I said earlier that we would talk about top-down and bottom-up mapping, and now is the time to think about that. What we're seeing here, is top-down mapping. I've drawn a big area. Top-down mapping, that's top-down on anything. You can also talk about top-down scenario design, for example. Top-down on anything basically means starting from the big picture and working down to the detail. Bottom-up starts with the detail and builds up to the big picture. So a lot of gamers use bottom-up mapping because they might start, for example, with a single dungeon or a single town next to the dungeon, the first dungeon, and map up from there. That's what I'm doing with the map for my D&D game that I did a little bit of work on last week. I'm starting with a tavern. That tavern has to be associated with a town. It's on the outskirts of that town. And then the scenarios are bringing in more features around it, and those are being added to the map. And it's a bottom-up. It's growing upwards. I don't know what it looks like from the top at all. You'll hear a lot of people talking about mapping either top-down or bottom-up. I don't really understand why people want to use only one of them. I feel that the best approach, as in many things in life, is to use all the elements that are available to you. So here, I've taken a top-down approach and produced a vast area of landmass that I'm going to be drawing my map on. I can run an entire campaign without ever leaving the borders of this map, despite the fact that clearly there is more land outside it. But now I'm swapping to bottom up, because my point here is that I want to be mapping the Anwannen Valley. I wanted the wider area because I wanted a sense of the world around the Anwannen. It's one thing to say, our game is set in the Anwannen Valley, I need to know about the Anwannen Valley. But that is making the mistake of thinking that the Anwannen Valley exists in isolation, and it doesn't. I've already mentioned that they resist raids from the folk of the plains to the north, and diplomatic maneuvers from the folk of the kingdom to the south. It's in a wider world, and by using a big map here, I can sketch in elements of this wider world, even if it's just a label. If all I map of the plains is just a label to the north of the Anwannen Valley, saying whatever I called them, plains. What did I call them? Aethlic. If I just put a label saying Aethlic Plains, and then underneath I put a label saying Kingdom of Vileworth, then I've already contextualized the Anwannen somewhat. And if I want to contextualize it more, I can build out beyond that. I said in the notes that Vileworth is the northernmost of the three kingdoms, so that means I know there's two other kingdoms to the south of it. And I've got space on this map to be able to put labels for those two kingdoms, if nothing else. And that gives me useful context to use in game, even though I am not detailing those things, because I can have a it gets pretty boring if everyone is from the Anwannen, or everyone is from the Vilewith. It gets pretty boring. So maybe you're used to seeing traders from the Vilewith coming into the Anwannen, buying whatever is made by the Anwanites and selling whatever they don't make. But maybe at the beginning of a scenario, a trader arrives from one of the other kingdoms that you don't normally see. That's creating interest by doing something different and something new. And if I haven't got those kingdoms, or I haven't got that context for the world, I can't do that. Now, you can make that up as you go, which is what bottom-up design is all about, that you add these details in as you create them. But I don't consider the 3 most important kingdoms in the region to be detail. I think that's broad strokes. And those broad strokes I like to have. I don't make the detail until I need the detail, but I like to have the broad strokes. So I've given myself room for the Ithalic Plains and whatever's beyond them, which I haven't yet decided. Maybe the people of the Anwannen have never crossed the Ithalic Plains to know what's on the far side. But maybe somebody who comes into Anwannen during a scenario has, and they do know. At which point that information gets to go on the map, even if it's only a label with no other detail. Even if I suddenly know that such and such a thing, such and such an empire exists on the far side of the Ithalic Plains, I can put that on the map, put that label on the map. It doesn't need to be there at the beginning though, because we're doing bottom up. But we're doing bottom up in a top-down way, if that makes any sense to you. As I also said earlier on, I have ADHD. My brain does not work the same way as a neurotypical brain. My brain also does not work the same way as another ADHD brain. That unfortunately is kind of the way that neurodiversity works. We're not just diverse from neurotypical, we're diverse from each other as well. So the way I do things might not work for you. I'm talking about design philosophies here that work for me. And I'm hoping that you can take something away from that that will be useful to you when making your maps. But if it just doesn't click to you, then don't use it. Do something that works for you. The only bits that you need to actually use are the bits that are physically, practically about making the software work, which is only a small part of drawing any map. Mapping software, and particularly using a CAD package for mapping, like Campaign Cartographer. Campaign Cartographer does not make maps. Campaign Cartographer translates what's in your head into a map. The map is made in your head, which is why I address the design philosophies behind mapping as much as I address the software itself. There's so many things that I've been mapping for so long now. There are so many things in my head that I don't even think about when I'm doing it. I'm trying to think about those things as I'm doing them and point out what I'm doing. Stuff like, for example, mountains. Way back when, in the 1980s, when God was but a small boy, and so was I, well, teenager, I found a game called Rolemaster. I found Rolemaster 2nd edition. Rolemaster is now in its unified edition, which came out last year, I believe. The first 2 books of that have been launched, but the whole range isn't yet out. So people are like using the books that are available with the books from the previous edition, mostly from Rolemaster Classic, which is a re-release of Rolemaster 2nd edition, which is the version that I found back in the 80s and 90s. Rolemaster is a fantasy role-playing game. It's an alternative to things like Dungeons and Dragons or RuneQuest, and it's much maligned and misunderstood because it's seriously crunchy. Now, I love a crunchy game, and Rolemaster is a crunchy game. It's got wonderful tables in it. It has been occasionally derisively termed Table Master or Rule Master because of how crunchy it is. But those tables serve a purpose, and it likes to go into detail. Now, something that is sadly missing from Classic Rolemaster Classic, the version that is very popular at the moment, that is, as I say, a reprint of 2, is the core rulebook of that was called Character Law and Campaign Law. And when they did Rolemaster Classic, they split them off and they released Character Law, saying that Campaign Law would get its own book later, and it never did. So all that campaign stuff, which was a smaller part of the original book, isn't there. Fortunately, some of it does still exist in the edition of Rolemaster that came out in between, Rolemaster Standard System, which became Rolemaster Fantasy Roleplay. They're the same system repackaged. There's no mechanical change between those two, if you see books with different labels on. And in Game Master Law, for Rolemaster Standard System / FRP, they included a version of the pages that I fell in love with from 2nd edition, which was a bit about drawing maps. Just a couple of pages on drawing maps, which was primarily randomizing drawing maps. It was a system for drawing random hex maps for your world. But as part of that, those randomizations were based on an understanding of the way geography and mapping kind of works. So while on the purely random level, it let you do things like, where does the coastline go? Start in this hex, roll a die roll percentile, to determine whether it moves to, because there's always 2 hexes coming out of any hex side on a hex. Is it we're going to the up hex or the down hex? And then roll again for the next hex. And you should gradually go from hex to hex on a random path. And it creates lovely random coastline. The fractal tool does the same thing for us here. Though we could perhaps use dice to determine whether we are going to go left or right from hex to hex if we really wanted to, or even left or right over a wider range to make the map more random. But then it had this bit about mountains. Again, randomizing the mountains and putting foothills on them. And it mentioned the fact that you have foothills on one side of the mountain over a wider area than on the other side of the mountain, because of the way the mountains are formed. It was the first place that I ever learned there were 2 ways mountains form. There's a lot of really quite good, not detailed geology, but just a bit of underlying understanding that you needed to know in order to make the things work. So love dipping into stuff like that, and I'm going to be dipping into stuff like that over the course of making this map, probably. But I'm probably going to have to look some of it up in advance between streams. So like maybe I'll reread the stuff about those mountains between this stream and next week I'll draw the mountain ranges. Mountain ranges are a good place to start once you've got your basic landmass, because they shape the bones of the land. And if you consider that as the mountains push up, they push up the area to the side of them, and that's how you get this landmass. So you're likely to be, its highest point is going to be in the middle. That's where the mountains are going to be, pretty much. Are going to be in the middle, and then it slopes down to the sea to either side. If you've got multiple mountain ranges, then obviously you get like an interference pattern almost between them. And that's how you start to build your landmass, is around those mountain ranges. When you're putting rivers in, they start at a high point and water flows downwards. So if the sea is your lowest point, then it's going to flow towards the sea. If you've got a sinkhole type arrangement over a wide area, a basin somewhere on the map, then they'll flow towards that instead. If you've got a dried up river, inland sea, for example, then the rivers will flow towards that. But then you've got to have an explanation as to why they're not filling it back up again. So why is that remaining dry? All kinds of fun stuff like this that you need to think about. You don't need to think about it. You can just put stuff wherever you think is cool on the map, and you've got a map, and most people aren't even going to ask any questions about that. But on some unconscious level, because we've seen the real world, we have an idea about what geography should look like. If we've ever looked at maps or orbital photographs, or just even photographs from planes of what large areas look like, we start to get an idea. And even if we don't know why, we'll see something and we'll think, well, that looks wrong. The obvious things being things like, here is the Arctic zone, and then next to it we've got a hot desert. Obviously, we're going to look at that and go, that's not right. What's happening here? Ironically, what we've actually got happening there is two incompatible deserts side by side, because it's a cold desert next to a hot desert, probably a hot sandy desert in this case. And you need an explanation for why they are adjacent, if they are adjacent, such as with the Anwannen in the Forgotten Realms, which is magically created. So it's up there in the north, and its north end does abut the Great Glacier. And you're like, how does this hot desert abut the Great Glacier? Well, the answer is that this desert is magically created. It's the result of a magical disaster millennia ago. There's an answer. It makes sense to the people who live in the Forgotten Realms, because they've grown up with it being there. Their normal is that desert being there. So they don't think, why is there a desert there? But we know better. We do think that. And as players, we think that, and we wonder why there is a desert there. Was the desert drawn before the explanation, or was the explanation created before the desert? I will never know unless I find myself someday having a conversation with Ed Greenwood. Even then I may never know, because he might not tell me, or he might lie. Yeah, if it was a mistake and he just put a desert in the wrong place, is he going to say, oh yeah, I screwed that up and put the desert in the wrong place? Or is he going to say, yes, I always had in mind this ancient magical disaster? I will never know. Even if I talk to him, I will never know, and I'm never going to talk to him. But this is important stuff. We have to think about whether the map will make sense when we're making it. So we are approaching the 2-hour mark, which is about how long I wanted to stream for one session. As I've said, next week we're going to start fleshing this map out by putting some mountains on it to shape the land. And importantly, when we do that, we will be defining the Anwannen Valley, because the Anwannen Valley is going to be between mountains. That's how valleys work. It's a slightly misleading name, however, because obviously I've not drawn a map 2,000 miles across so that I can have a standard mountain valley which might be 5 miles across in it. The Anwannen Valley is going to be a larger area between two mountainous highlands. The borders of the valley are going to be highlands, then mountains past that, forest in the middle. We already know there's a forest because we gave it a name that we can't pronounce unless we get a run up at it, which is of course the Anwannen. See, with a run up we can do it. We can say Anwannen, but we do need a run up at it. But it's going to be a large area between two mountains, and we're calling it a valley because of that. And its people refer to it as a valley because of that, because look either way and there's mountains. So we're there, therefore this is a valley. But within that valley, there may well be valleys. There certainly will be hills and dales and forests. And next week, that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing mountains, and we're going to be defining the extents of the Anwannen Valley. And when we have done that, that will tell us what we're working on from here on in, because wherever those mountains, wherever that valley is, we will be zooming in, and that will be the extent of our map while working on it. We won't care about anything outside at that stage, because we're now working on that bottom-up portion of the map, and we will ignore the fact that the map is huge. The map being huge is a thing for another day. So we'll save that again now, and we will say thank you for watching. There is this stream is going to be exported to YouTube, and I will be creating a Mappa Monday Anwannen Valley playlist on YouTube so that people can go through all of these in one go. If you have any specific questions or suggestions, then feel free to make them. Let's see whether I have a bot working. I think I might, but who knows? Do I have a Discord command, for example? And the answer is no, I don't. There's a suggestion. Somebody suggest to me that I set up a Discord command for the bot to give me my Discord link. Okay, so CoffeeBot has been throwing... yes, CoffeeBot and Stream Elements have both been throwing up my coffee link. I need to turn off the Stream Elements one. That's something I need to remember. and I will need to throw in a Discord invitation. I thought I had one on my bot. I think I have one that comes up if people are typing in chat, but nobody's been typing in chat, so it hasn't been posted. I will obviously need to add something to just bring the link up when we want it. For now, we'll just not worry about it. Yeah, I have a Discord. I use it primarily for organising my the games that I'm running, but it is a place that you can obviously find me to talk to me. You can also direct message me on Twitch, though I won't necessarily see it until the next Monday when I'm setting up for the next Twitch stream. I very rarely use X. I used to use Twitter a reasonable amount. I very rarely use X, but I do have an account on X. That's @fishnotfish. So you can try that, and I might see it. Who knows? I'll get more organised about allowing for feedback. And I'm also on startplaying.games. When I've got some games scheduled on there, I will start promoting them during the streams, so people can find me and play games with me on there. That is a site for finding paid for games by professional games masters. My games at the moment are not paid for, so it's just me running a game, and they're all being done for free, which means unfortunately you can't search for me. I don't know whether I'm going to be streaming again between now and next Monday, but there's a good chance I will, because I'm off work for 2 weeks. So hopefully I'm going to do some more streaming. I won't be working on Anwannen because that is Mappa Monday. That is Monday morning. So the next thing, 6 o'clock UK time next Monday, is when we will be doing the next Mappa Monday stream and working on the Anwannen. But I might do some casual RP ramblings about games, or I might play some tabletop related video games. I'm getting really into MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries at the moment. That counts because I've been playing the Battletech board game that it was inspired by, again, since the 1980s. Been doing this a while, this gaming lark. So yeah, if you want to see me rambling about stuff and possibly playing some games, then do throw me a follow on Twitch. If you're watching this on YouTube and you want to see some more stuff like this, then subscribe to my YouTube channel, comment, like, etc., all of that nonsense. And I hope you have enjoyed it. And to steal a line from Richard Wiseman's podcast, if you didn't enjoy it, tell your friends you did enjoy it. Why should you be the only one to suffer? And hopefully I will see you again next Monday.
1, 2, 3, 4. Whoa. Whoa. The fire's getting stronger.